Hello. Today we are going to be looking at the work of Bruno Latour, and in some ways this is a discipline defining moment. We've spoken about what it means to study the social. We've also spoken about how the social comes into being as a category of analysis. Well, Bruno Latour kind of unsettles all of that. And so we are back to square one. We are asking the question, what is the object of study for the discipline of sociology? And today I'm going to be presenting one of Bruno Latour's book, that is Reassembling the Social. This book he wrote as, and you can see the subtitle, it is an introduction to actor network theory. Bruno Latour introduced actor network theory in 1980s in his book Science in Action, but then it came under a lot of critique because, as you will see, it's making some pretty controversial claims and he's not shying away from controversy. So we are going to be reading together some parts of this text and trying to understand what is it that he means by reassembling the social. Let's begin. So one of the major critiques that Bruno Latour has of sociology as it exists as a discipline is that sociologists have taken their object of study for granted, in that they've already assumed that there are certain groups that exist, that nations need to be studied, institutions need to be studied, capitalism needs to be studied, patriarchy is already always there. In doing so, in kind of assuming certain categories and assuming certain associations, they have become intellectually lazy in that they are not really investigating what makes those, what appears as a cohesive whole. Almost he actually uses the word black box. How does it come together and continue to assume a more stable form? One of his primary quests in his vast repertoire of work has been to question that the social is not what explains. So as sociologists, we also assume, oh, that's a social phenomena. Oh, that's, something that is because of social relations. And by saying that, we are not really explaining much. We are just using a certain rhetorical phrase and assuming that the other person would understand. He says, in fact, it is the social itself that needs to be explained. Bruno Latour was born in 1947 in France and had a pretty long career. He was director of Sciences Po in France and he wrote several books. One of his early works was Laboratory Life, which was an ethnography of a laboratory in a science institution. And through that, he was trying to understand how scientific decisions and theories are made. So a lot of people assumed in a sense or read his work as if he was debunking science or showing science as a myth, because he was one of the first to use the term science as a social construction. That was not his aim. He was trying to show how deliberations, how funding motivations, how contemporary constellations or situations create particular questions, what instruments are available to answer those questions, what kind of discussions go into framing questions and therefore also making theories. So he wanted to really see the social in the science, and he did that in Laboratory Life. To some extent, he follows that process in the Pasteurization of France, where he looks at the work of Louis Pasteur, and then in Science in Action. And in Science in Action, he introduces actor network theory. But then there is a huge amount of critique. He also is very instrumental in and is considered the founder of the discipline of science studies, or sometimes also referred to as science and technology studies. Eventually, as he develops his work, he becomes instrumental in the discipline of political ecology, and more recently he was writing about the planetary crisis. So you can see, like, he has moved with what were the critical issues of the time that he was writing in. At the time that he was writing, science had and still continues to have, in fact, almost like a god-like presence, right? It gives to us the objective truth. Usually when we say, how do you know that it's true? We say it's scientifically proven. So even in commonsensical parlance, science has entered into that domain which is almost unquestionable. So by showing how scientific theories are constructed inside a laboratory, he is actually kind of opening up the black box of science for us, right? So that's what he was trying to do when he said science is a social construction. Then he follows up by, we have never been modern. In this, he questions the dichotomy between nature and society. He says, we have never been modern because we prop up modernity on this false dichotomy between nature and society, which really is only in our rhetoric or in our discourse, but doesn't really exist in the way even that we function. He investigates the love of technology, the making of law. We are focusing on reassembling the social. And then towards the later part, as you see, he comes up with the theory of Gaia. He's looking at climate change. He's looking at other ecological planetary crises. And he passes away in 2022 at the age of 75. So again, a vast amount of work that is there. And we are only going to be looking at a small little pocket of it. Although I hope it will give you a sense of how he is wanting to define the discipline of sociology and social sciences in general. So coming back to something that we started the course with, the category of the social. Well, he's already said that there is nothing called the social that exists. And in fact, he critiques sociology and the understanding of the social as one coming up with these different spheres which don't really exist in different spheres. Natural and social, according to him, don't exist separate from each other. Or something that is semiotic, that is, meaning in our own minds, is not, again, detached from nature or social. So by making these compartments, we have actually done injustice to the understanding of how social relations, how associations, how collectives come together. The other issue with this kind of sociology that he calls sociology of the social, the conventional way of doing sociology, is that we have divided the social into a hierarchical system where somehow it is the system, it is the structures that create particular kinds of institutions, and then those institutions govern how individuals can function or not function. So in this hierarchical system, it also seems like that there is something out there, like a structure, that dictates how we can function or what is possible for us to do and what is not. So thereby, in some ways, taking away the agency of the actor. And he solidly critiques that. He wants to make the social or understanding of the social, although he wouldn't call it that. He'll call it momentary associations, he'll call it the collective. He wants to see how these collectives come together, and the collectives can be natural and human together. So it's not a thing. It's not a thing that is already always out there. It is something that is continuously being assembled, and the task of the sociologist is to see how that assemblage is coming together and coming apart. So he calls the kind of sociology that actor network theory does the sociology of associations. Now he's coming to the sociology of associations from his long study of science itself, of how science is coming together as a collective in terms of ideas, materials, theories, discourse, but through wide-ranging associations, diverse associations between instruments, funding, tools, previous ideas, the universe, nature, human engagements, and so on. So how does he ask us to then do such a sociology of associations? He says the thing to pay attention to, or what needs, not the thing is not the right word to use here, what we need to pay attention to are moments of controversy, because moments of controversy reveal disjunctures, moments of controversy reveal contradictions. They're kind of like a microscope where you can zoom in on what is not fitting together and then rework your theory or rework your way of doing sociology such that it becomes little more clearer. He starts off the book, in fact his book is divided into two major parts, apart from the introduction, and there's an interlude, and the conclusion is the first part. He teaches us methodologically how to deploy controversies, and in the next part he gives the way to move forward, right? So there's a first move, second move, and third move. In the early part it is how to deploy controversies, and in that he also gives about 5 various ways to do so. So the first one, the first controversial, the way to deploy controversy is about the nature of groups. Now, in terms, he says, most sociology has assumed a group to already exist. So, a sociologist might go and study how a particular social group, let's say a group of black feminists, or a group of teachers, or a group of bureaucrats, or a nation, or any other institution exists, right? So, in that defining, he says they've already defined it, and therefore the labor of actually finding out how that group comes to be, who takes a call on who belongs, who doesn't belong, what mechanisms exist to bring that group together, how is that group tenuously held in place, and what are the key things that are tenuously holding it in place, such that if they break, then what would come apart, and so on. So these are the kind of questions, these associations, these linkages that he wants us to follow. Now here I'm also thinking of, although he doesn't use that at all, but considering all that we've studied so far, I'm also thinking of Benedict Anderson's work on imagining the nation. And we spoke about how he discusses the census, the museum, the newspaper, printing press, the novel coming out of it, all of this as central to bringing together the collective, the imagined collective that we call the nation. And I thought that is in some ways a good way to demonstrate simply what Bruno Latour is trying to urge us to do. And Anderson also then, in that sense similar to Latour, pays attention to non-human things also in arguing for the centrality of the imagined nation's production, right? So he's saying the printing press had a role to play, the newspaper had a role to play, the census and those techniques had a role to play. And I've put up here an image from the Swadeshi movement where one could say, as an example, how, let's say, pieces of cloth, pieces of hand-woven cloth that were made in India are positioned in opposition to the factory cloth produced in British factories, and therefore these two are held in tension with each other in order to define we the people, the coming together of the Indian nation, and they, the British colonizers, right? So a piece of cloth is an actor here who is central to the formation of this group in this way of telling the story. So he is asking us to really look at what is bringing the group together. Now here he is also taking us back to an earlier debate, in fact a 1903 debate, where the sociologist Gabriel Tarde and Emile Durkheim actually had a debate on the ways of doing sociology. Bruno Latour argues that we went in the direction of Emile Durkheim, the way he defined sociology and the way he did sociology. But had we gone in the direction of Gabriel Tarde, we would have reached a very, very different sociology at this time. Gabriel Tarde was a critic, he was a senior scholar, and he was a critic of the way in which Durkheim did sociology, in the sense that he said, you're already taking the social for granted and you are not really following the associations, the connections, the linkages. And he wanted that kind of sociology, a more fluid way of doing sociology, where you could follow social relations and social connections and through that come to a particular understanding. And this debate, the link that I have up here on the slide actually is a writing by Bruno Latour, which narrates this particular debate and what could have been in terms of sociology. From Reassembling the Social, I have put up one small text here, which I'll read out. He writes, in most situations, we use social to mean that which has already been assembled and acts as a whole, without being too picky on the precise nature of what has been gathered, bundled, and packaged together. So his way of doing sociology is cautioning us against this taken for grantedness, this already assumed object of study for sociology. And in some ways, this is also reminding me of Doreen Massey's work, because remember, she speaks about the concept of throw-togetherness, and she says that we need to retain a kind of openness in the way we do research. Only then can the possibility of social transformation or politics be possible. social is then not a thing, and social is something that needs to be assembled. I've put up here an image of a fabric. Now, we see a cloth as something that is an object, that is, as something that is in front of us, and it appears as a whole piece of cloth. Whereas when you start to look closely, the cloth is made up of a range of, warps and wefts woven together in intricate ways, sometimes forming a pattern, sometimes forming a texture, sometimes giving a certain color, but it is still always warp and weft that come together to make the cloth, even if the cloth appears as a whole, as something that is complete in itself. As sociologists, we need to trace those warps and wefts. So, in that sense, we need to start explaining what the social phenomena, process, relation, thing that we are already assuming at the beginning of our research. Here he goes back to Marx, and he in fact wants to turn his idea around. I'll read. He writes, "It might be time to put Marx's famous quote back on its feet. Social scientists have transformed the world in various ways. The point, however, is to interpret it. But to interpret, we need to abandon the strange idea that all languages are translatable in the already established idiom of the social." So, the social needs to also understand that there can be different frames of reference, that not everything will translate exactly as it is. And in those moments of translation, also some transformation will happen. Now, he gives us two terms, and he says that an object or a conversation or a group of people can be an intermediary in bringing about change, or can be a mediator. The intermediary is what transports meaning or force without transformation. So it is just right there, but it won't change anything. It will take idea A to idea A from place A to place B, but it will still remain idea A. So defining its input is enough to define its output. And some things are intermediaries, like he gives the example of a computer, which might be an intermediary, but then sometimes when it is broken and it is changing some things, it could also be a mediator. Similarly, a mundane conversation could be a mediator if complex ideas are coming out of it, if through that mundane conversation people's ideas or thoughts are changing, it is bringing about some transformation, then a mundane conversation can be a mediator. But the same conversation, or in fact a meeting of senior professors, could be an intermediary if it is just perfunctory, such that the decision is already made, but one is going through the act of the meeting in order to reach the decision that is already made. So then it's just an intermediary. Let's read what he has to write about this. An intermediary is what transports meaning or force without transformation, and a mediator will transform, translate, distort, and modify the meaning or the elements they are supposed to carry. So a mediator will always mediate, it will always change, it will always transform. Now, if we basically confuse mediators with intermediary, like one of the tasks of sociology is to identify in a social grouping, in a collective, what is a mediator and what are the intermediaries. And if we already assign something to be a mediator or an intermediary, then we are confusing cause and effect. And this is one of his critiques also of sociology, which was one of Tardé's critique also of Durkheim, is that they are confusing cause and effect. He says cause and effect are only a retrospective way of interpreting events. This is true of social and natural events. Alright, so the other way in which he is asking us to deploy controversies is the idea of action is overtaken. Now, it sounds like a confusing phrase, but let's go over it and I think you will understand. He says action is not done under the full control of consciousness. Action should rather be felt as a node, a knot, and a conglomerate of many surprising sets of agencies that have to be slowly disentangled. Supposing I walk into a classroom. Now, the action is that I've walked into the classroom, but there can be many reasons and I may not even be aware of all of them in terms of my walking into the classroom to give the lecture, to meet a student, what might unfold in the process. Maybe I walked in while casually talking to another student and in conversation kind of didn't realize, or I was instructed to do so from the top, or the classroom needed to be inspected and therefore I walked in. So there can be multiple reasons or associations connected to a particular act. And although the example I've given is kind of simplistic and not quite catching it, but the idea is that the task of a sociologist is to follow the actor, is to keep following the actor and then the connected associations, so that through these meticulous followings, one can arrive at possibilities of cause and effect. It would still not be quite settled, but that act itself of following will be revealing. So if we are to follow actors, then who is an actor, right? He says an actor in the hyphenated expression actor network is not the source of an action, but the moving target of a vast array of entities swarming toward it. Now an actor is someone that can bring about transformation. But he says that it is not a sovereign individual. It is not somebody who is acting totally out of one's free will, unconnected to the rest of the world. That actor is a moving target of a vast array of entities, such as others' ideas, orders, the way one navigates a particular environment, the weather, how one is feeling internally, all of that. And therefore, because it is connected and a result of so many different assemblages or associations, an action is borrowed, distributed, suggested, influenced, dominated, betrayed, translated. It is very dynamic. It is in motion. The action is in association. Now let's step back for a second and take a look at Weber's definition of action. Right? Remember, we studied Weber and he wrote, action is social insofar as by virtue of the subjective meaning attached to it by the acting individual. So Weber is one assuming that an actor is always an individual and that the actor has assigned a subjective meaning to it that is independent of any outside causes. So the individual is a sovereign subject in the way Weber is looking at it, and that idea Bruno Latour is not okay with. This is both his method of deploying a controversy, but I would also say that this is one of the most controversial of his claims that he is making, where he is arguing that objects too have agency. Here, it's also important to specify that he doesn't kind of mean it in the sense that objects have a similar kind of agency as humans, but they can be mediators. They can be also instrumental in bringing about transformation. So in that sense, objects are also agents. Let's read what he writes here. He says, anything that does modify a state of affairs by making a difference is an actor. So that's his definition here. Very different from the subjective meaning assigned by an individual that Weber gave here. Anything that does modify a state of affairs by making a difference is an actor. Or if it has no figuration yet, then an actant. This, of course, does not mean that these participants determine the action. It is not that baskets cause the fetching of provisions. If I'm taking a basket to a grocery store, it is not that the basket is the cause of determining the action, or that hammers impose the hitting of the nail, but they are, key to the way it happens, and I will explain it in a second. In addition to determining and serving as a backdrop for human action, and he's put determining in quotes here, things might authorize, allow, afford, encourage, permit, suggest, influence, block, render possible, forbid, and so on. So I'll give the example of the hammer and the nail that he also articulates in his writing. So Let's look at the hammer. The hammer consists of the wooden handle and the iron ore top, right, the head. The iron ore might be coming from mines that hold iron ore that was formed at the beginnings of the universe. The wood for the handle came, let's say, from Amazon forests or forests that were planted about 100 years back or longer. The factory that made this hammer was located in yet another place, and that it was made some 10-15 years ago and then bought through a store that has these kind of things. So there are spatial connections, there are temporal connections in the sense that it goes back to the beginning of the universe. All of that embodied, coming together in the hammer itself. And then when the hand holds the hammer to hit the nail, the hand is also affected by the kind of grip that it enables, the kind of weight that it holds, and then how you can hit the nail. So when the action is happening, when the hand that holds the hammer is hitting the nail, it is a hybrid. It is the hand that is holding the hammer. So it is not just purely the human that is making the nail go into the table, neither it is purely the hammer that is making the nail go into the table, but the hybrid of a human hand and the hammer, right? So that is how he tries to explain how objects too have an agency. And I have one more example in my next slide, but I want to take a brief moment to read out Durkheim's writing about this here. Durkheim writes, "They are the matter upon which the social forces of society act, but by themselves they release no social energy. As an active factor then, the human milieu itself remains." So for Durkheim, the only active factor, the only actors are humans. The rest are basically forces on which society acts, right? So they are in some ways backdrops. And it is in contrast to that kind of understanding in the discipline of sociology that Bruno Latour is writing in contrast to. The other example he gives in a separate paper titled On Technical Mediation is the citizen gun. Now here he's looking at the controversy or the debate in the United States about the availability, the easy availability of guns and its relation to, let's say, school shootings, right? The vast amount of school shootings. So there is one group that argues that it is the people who are, it is the person who's committing it is a criminal, and what kind of society is it that is giving birth to these kind of criminal tendencies? So that would be one kind of question. The other kind of way of looking at it is that the easy availability of the gun itself, it is the gun and the fact that it is right there is causing these school shootings. So there should not be the easy availability of the gun. So one side is the gun, the other side is the criminal individual. Bruno Latour says we need to look at the hybrid. We need to look at the citizen-gun. He asks us to imagine the kind of posture having a gun in one's hand initiates, right? So if somebody is holding a gun in their hand, one imagines that the body language changes, the behavior changes, the attitude changes, and it, along with the act of holding the gun itself, might create particular emotions in oneself, and therefore it is that fused subject, it is that citizen gun that is performing the act of the school shootings, and that is how we need to study it. You cannot study just the criminal individual, the so-called criminal individual, or just the guns themselves. So he writes, "You are another subject because you hold the gun. The gun is another object because it has entered into a relationship with you." So these kind of hybrids is what sociologists need to look at, the associations, right? What happens when an individual holds a gun? All right, another way to deploy controversies is by paying attention to what is usually seen as a matter of fact, and he says that we need to look at it instead as matters of concern. Now here I've put up an image that we've seen before. It's a painting of an experiment on a bird in the air pump. You can trace it back to one of my early lectures on the emergence of the social, and it's a 1768 painting by Joseph Derby, where you see a collective, where a group of people coming together. The center of the painting is this instrument which is producing the vacuum, and they've put a bird inside that vacuum in order to see what happens to it. Light is falling on particular faces and on the experiment, and you see a mix of observation, you mix of emotion and curiosity, all of that coming in here. He's also, through this process, actually looking at how certain scientific facts come to be constructed, and this painting is very nicely showing how these associations, these networks, emotions, human gatherings, human instrument, tool, bird, light gatherings are all key to the emergence of the scientific fact. But he also wants to differentiate between the matters of fact and matters of concern. Here one could say that he is replying to climate skeptics. So, for example, while the scientific fact might show that the earth is rapidly changing because of global warming, skeptics say that, oh, all science is a social construction, this is all geopolitically motivated, and so on. Bruno Latour says that yes, it is this is data that we are seeing, but instead of kind of calling these matters of fact, which are then unquestionable, can be debunked also, we need to look at it as matters of concern, because matters of concern show a certain assemblage coming together, but it doesn't solidify it. So there is room for discussion, there is room for debate, but it can't that easily be debunked. This positivism paragraph is from the conclusion, and then the earlier one is from this chapter on matters of fact to matters of concern. He writes, positivism in its natural or social form, in its reactionary or progressive form, is not wrong because it forgets human consciousness and decides to stick with cold data. It is wrong politically. It has reduced matters of concern into matters of fact too fast, without due process. So that's the issue, he says. He says facts are not simply true or false. By calling something a fact, you can then have two groups. One is calling it true, the other is calling it fact. He says we are losing the point. These are matters of concern for all of us. They are what, he says, facts are what is assembled. The critic is not one who debunks, but one who assembles. So our attention should go towards how is this thing, this situation, this particular moment getting assembled, right? So that's the task of the sociologist. The other criticism that he has of the discipline of sociology, and I spoke about it earlier on in this lecture, is this idea of how, let's say, the structure of capitalism or power is somehow up there and therefore controlling individual actors as if they were puppets to be controlled, right? So he says that kind of a image, in fact, even if you say that, like he's been critiqued for not paying attention to politics, of not paying attention to inequalities that exist in society, he said actually it's the other way around. By assuming that such a power hierarchy already exists, by assuming that capitalism shapes relations in this way, by making those assumptions, you are actually not doing the work of understanding how that assemblage of power came to be how it is, right? And in order to understand how that assemblage of power came to be as it is, we have to give agency to our actors. We have to see our actors as acting out of particular motivations that are not situated just inside them, that are situated in this vast web of associations, and therefore we need to follow those associations. And in doing so, you will see how topographies emerge, but you can't assume them in the beginning. Gives the example of a filing cabinet. He says paying attention to a mundane object like a filing cabinet. There is one way of looking at bureaucracy in which Weber looked at bureaucracy. But then the way Bruno Latour would look at it, let's say through the example of the filing cabinet, is he would pay attention to how it is storing information, how it is categorizing, how information is categorized in the filing cabinet, what kinds of categorizations does it make possible, what kind of maybe fluid categorizations are not possible in a filing cabinet, how information is retrieved from there, and then how is it transported, who does that work. So his main thing is pay attention to all of this, and only then can you come to an understanding of how the social is being assembled, how the collective is momentarily forming. I'll end my lecture with this particular image over here, that is of a cartographer. He says our job is like a cartographer who is not like sitting and debating about whether if he has to trace the Indian coastal peninsula. The cartographer will meticulously trace each and every turn and way the earth and the landform and the ocean meet. And that kind of meticulous tracing, that kind of following the actor is what we need to do. Not assume things and not take things as already always there, as an object ready to be studied. So I end today's lecture here, but we are going to continue with Bruno Latour in my next lecture, where I'll look at the ways forward for sociology. Thank you and see you then.